This week we have two separate guests on Writers' Voices. First up, singer-songwriter Doug Hoekstra with his new CD and short story collection 10 Seconds in Between, followed by historical writer Pam Jenoff with her latest World War II novel, The Woman with the Blue Star. Welcome to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. We have a split show today, two separate guests, both of whom have been with us before. First up will be Doug Hoekstra, whom I'll introduce to you in a moment, followed by historical writer Pam Jenoff with her new book, The Woman with the Blue Star. I hope you'll stick around for both segments. Our first guest today was with us a couple of years ago with a book of poetry, and now he's back with a CD and a book of short stories. Doug Hoekstra is a Chicago-bred, Nashville-based writer and musician educated at DePaul University in the Windy City and Belmont University in the Music City, whose prose, poetry, and nonfiction have appeared all over the place. We're talking with him today about his latest story collection, 10 Seconds in Between, and also his new CD, The Day Deserved. Welcome back to Writers' Voices, Doug.
Thanks. Thanks for having me again. Appreciate it.
So, what's with all this creativity?
Pandemic? Not exclusively, but that's part of it. You know, I think the main thing is my son, hit his teenage years, and I've been so focused on him as I should be, and as was just wonderful. And of course he hit 14, 15, he started to kind of hang out on his own more and do his own thing, which is great. And I was just feeling that it had been a while since I made music. I'd been writing, and I just felt the urge to. We went on a couple of trips where we visited a lot of my musician pals, and I started to think about things that I wanted to write about musically. And so that was the impetus for getting back in the studio and writing some songs. I mean, I hadn't written any in a decade since he was little. And I demoed all those at home and went into a studio just before the pandemic. But a lot of the last track on the CD was finished remote during the pandemic, and then a lot of the prep work on the CD happened during the pandemic. So that was the music end of things. As to the short story collection, well, as you know, we talked a couple of years ago about the book of poetry, and I'd always written prose here and there as well. And that's something I've kind of always done on an ongoing way, even when I was focused on my son, because there's something about it that's a little more portable, and you can do around those sorts of schedules. So I've just been writing pieces that I landed here and there, and then it started to seem to coalesce into some kind of collection. And I started to shop it around and found this press. They're based in Florida and Canada, called Better Than Starbucks Press. They published some of my short works before, and they were into it, and they were very helpful in helping me, sequence and kind of get more of a little bit of a coalescing to the book. And a friend of mine, Chad Johnson, did the cover, and then I had a book on. And then they happened to just kind of trigger at the same time. I mean, I had no idea, obviously, how long this would go on, the social distancing and everything. So I just kind of finally picked a date for the CD, and then the press was okay with, they had targeted June 1st. And then the CD landed on a European label, too, called Continental Records, and they were okay with the date that we had for the CD. So it just kind of all came together to hit right now.
And what does your son make of all this?
Well, it's funny because, music and writing and everything is such a key part of my life, but really when he hit maybe, 4 or 5 years old, I just put it all aside because I didn't want to be distracted. I just wanted to be So I wanted to be there for him 100%. So he hasn't really seen me do any of this. And that was kind of another motivation, particularly for doing the record. because, again, we'd visited some friends of mine overseas and here in the States who were musicians, and we'd hung out with them, and I kind of wanted them to be around at least a little piece of it. And on the CD, I pulled them in to play clarinet on a track, Late Night Ramble, which was also a bit of a motivation. I really wanted to let him have that experience and just have him on a song playing, you know?
Oh, I bet that was cool.
It was great, and he did great. And there's a funny story because, you know, he played clarinet in band, and I was concerned, you know, if you don't go into a studio, it's not a big deal, but if you're not experienced doing it, sometimes people can get nervous or whatever. So I scored the part. I kind of wrote out kind of my ideas for the part. And so we practiced it a couple times at home, and then we went in, and he did really well. But then after we got that part done, I said, well, you know, here, why don't you do just something sort of ad-lib on these parts in the verses? And, you know, honestly, probably the part he came up with was better than the part I came up with. So that just goes to show, you know.
So tell us a little bit, give us sort of a brief summary of your background as a musician.
Well, I played, you know, I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. I grew up in Naperville. And I played in a couple bands, a band in my hometown, and then we were in a band in the city called Bucket Number 6 that was sort of like alt country before that was a thing. And, you know, we played the circuit a lot. We played in Iowa a lot too, by the way.
Ah.
Yeah, and, you know, Madison and Minneapolis and that whole thing. And so that went pretty well, but it reached a certain point. It's hard to keep bands together. And so at some point, as we wound up, we had played down in Nashville. And, you know, my wife at the time, my son's mother, she thought it was, she really liked it here, and I liked it here. And I just thought it would be a good place to go to do something solo because the musicians are so good. I mean, everybody thinks country music, and that's true, but there's just such a wealth of musicians in every genre that come here. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to do something on my own, Nashville would be a really good place. I mean, I like the community, but I thought it would be really good for that. And so then I came down here, I just started doing things, and I had, I don't know, 7 records. I mean, I got a lot of, you know, independent labels and things like that, and a fair amount of European labels picking them up. And so, you know, I traveled around in the States, and I traveled quite a bit in Europe. But as anybody will tell you, that is that's its own focus, you know, that can be consuming, and which is why I stepped away when my son was born. But, you know, it was like an independent artist level. These are independent labels and things, and I get good things happening, but it's not like I was, you know, whatever, on American Idol and things of that nature, you know.
Right. And it's being a touring musician, you can make a living, but it's a tough way to make a living.
Yeah,
you have to love it.
Yeah, and I also think it's like anything you decide early on. Like, I mean, people come down and they try to crack certain aspects, say, of the business in Nashville, whether that's like, you know, co-writing and trying to place cuts on country records, or whether that's, you know, working in studios or being a session person or whatever. And for me, I just always felt like my strengths were kind of like doing this sort of, you know, singer-songwriter with a twist thing that seemed to speak to my strengths. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. I mean, I'm inspired by people like Dylan and Leonard Cohen and people like that, and I wanted to follow that path. Well, that's a much less commercially viable path to follow. And there's a lot of good people out there doing it, but they're going to be more contained by that choice. You know, I mean, that's just how it is.
Right.
And so
right.
I think, and that's true of anything. It's true of writers. It's anything. So I think that's part of it. You kind of wind up in that spot, but I always felt like that it's so competitive, and this is true too of writers or musicians, that you really have to go with your strength, and you're just trying to have to develop what's you and let the chips fall where they may in that sense, because you want to produce good work that you can be happy with, you know.
So you stepped away from the music business for a decade or so, and when you came back into the studio, what's changed over that time?
Well, a lot has changed and not changed. It's really funny because, I mean, I wanted to make a record that was a little different than what I'd done before. And so I demoed a lot, and I was really intent on kind of like stretching the songs out a little more, both lyrically and musically, and do more with crafted arrangements. I mean, the band was great, and they made it their own, but I wanted to kind of have more of a roadmap than I normally would. So that was different for me. But, you know, again, you develop your style, and I can't imagine, like, you know, Bob Dylan just turned 80, right? Mm-hmm. And he's so amazing to me because he manages to constantly change yet still be him. And I don't know, people, you know, that's super, super difficult. So I think you kind of develop your style, and then you try to build on it and get away from it while still retaining the essence of you, right? And that's kind of a interesting paradigm. And so with the record, that's kind of how I approached it. But in terms of the recording process and everything like that, that wasn't much different, because it's not like I was going to go in and do a bunch of loops, and I wasn't going to throw down some beats, you know. So we went in with a good band, and you know, we followed those roadmaps, and we recorded pretty quickly, and that was all pretty similar. The business has changed a lot in 10 years because of things like streaming.
Yeah.
And because of the erosion of, like, local media, I think, you know.
And you put out a CD. Do bands necessarily actually even cut physical CDs anymore, or musicians?
Yeah, they do and they don't. Like, I mean, a lot of people, I think, are into this idea of, quote, dropping singles. And I actually did that to a degree. I made a bunch of videos for this record, which I hadn't done before. But I don't know, you know, a lot of people will say, okay, people don't buy albums, right? But then I think that's kind of like a self-defeating prophecy. Like, I like albums. I like albums that work together as a piece. You know, I mean, whether it's something like, you know, I'll quote Bob again, like Blood on the Tracks or Astral Weeks by Van Morrison, or, you know, any of the Beatles albums. These are all like entities. And so I just wanted to make that kind of record, and I decided, well, I don't care. And, you know, you can still peel off singles and try to promote it that way if you want. But there does seem to be more of a focus on that. And I think that's because of the streaming platforms. But, you know,
right.
That's a whole other thing. I mean, at the end of the day, I think you know, since we're talking about all this, I'll probably sell more in Europe than I will in the States, because I think people are, generally speaking, more tuned in to buying that physical product and to following an artist and everything still than they are. And that's a very broad generalization, but I think it'll probably be true, you know?
Yeah, and, you know, a lot of people don't even have CD players anymore. They don't put them in cars automatically, and they don't all come in computers anymore. And so you have to think about how you're going to play your CD.
Yeah, I know. And now you're depressing me.
I know.
And, you know, it's funny because everything changes, and like, I think there are elements of, it's like anything, any technology, anything has its positives and its negatives. So I'm not oblivious to that, but I do like the idea of a set of songs. I guess people can technically stream it as a piece if they want.
Yeah.
You know,
but
because
it's tougher
available
to do.
in that way.
And I'll admit, I haven't really adapted to streaming music, and so I don't listen to as much new music as I used to, because I'm not getting the CDs, and I don't really stream. So
yeah. Well, this is a whole philosophical question, but the question is, does the whole idea of streaming cause people not to listen as closely? I think probably. I think it becomes more background music.
Yeah. Plus, the other thing about the CD is you've got the liner notes, you've got the lyrics often. They're right there. You can read them. You did a lovely job with that. And there's something about the visual aspect of it too that matters.
Yeah, I agree. 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's all a part and parcel. It's a work of art that all works together. But hey, at the end of the day, you still have to just do what you can do to get it out there. And I guess one of the positives is you do have multiple formats now. You do have that possibility. We didn't do vinyl on this, but a lot of acts will do the vinyl version, they'll do the CD version, they'll do the digital version. This version will have bonus cuts, and I don't know. I guess that's okay. That's like a positive of it.
And your videos I see are available on your website,
yes,
which is doughoekstra.net, and I want to spell that. So it's Doug, DOUGHOEKSTRA.net. And so check them out. Let's go to the book. Let's go to the book. 10 Seconds in Between by Doug Hoekstra. Is this your first published short story collection?
No, it's actually my third. I did one. My first one was a book called Bothering the Coffee Drinkers, which was a collection of music fiction. And it came out on Jenoff. This is a friend of mine who was in Tennessee, and he's up in Woodstock, Illinois now. And that actually got an independent publisher award thing for it placed for best short fiction. So I was real pleased about that. And then I did a very, very small run of baseball themed short stories called The 10th Inning. And that actually I did myself. I just kind of did that as a quasi sell it from the stage kind of thing. So those are my two other short story collections. So
the first one you said was called Bother the Coffee Drinkers?
Yeah, Bother the Coffee Drinkers. It's a story about a guy the title story is about a guy who goes around, as I used to, play all these little Borders books and music. You remember when they have those? Mm-hmm. And, you would do them kind of because they were always great to do in the afternoon, and you pick up a little extra money and whatever. But sometimes you would be stuck in the corner where you really wouldn't be playing music as much as you'd be bothering the coffee drinkers, right?
Right. Well,
and so it deals with this individual struggles in that environment. So
yeah, because if I go to a coffee shop or a venue where someone's playing live music, but that's not the purpose that I went there for, it's like, I feel like I need to be polite and listen and clap, but really I want to talk to the person that I'm with. It's a tough situation for both sides.
It is for sure. But anyway, there's a lot more to it in that story, but the whole book is like music-based fictions, really.
Now, what is 10 Seconds in Between based on?
Well, there's a line in a story about how I used to tell this to my students when I taught too, because I thought it was interesting. That when you meet somebody, between 7 and 17 seconds, psychologists will say whether or not you figure out whether you're going to connect with that person. Mm. So then of course the question is what happens in those 10 seconds in between, right? That's where the title of the book comes. And like a lot of stories, or narratives, there's a lot of connections between people or misconnections in the various stories. So I thought it would be a good title. But then also you think about if that is true, like we put it all down to these 10 seconds. I mean, how much of it is random? How much of it is like just predisposed experience and DNA and all these other things? And so to me, it also raises the question of, I think people often think that they are smarter or more in control than they really are, because there's a lot of times there's these other factors in play that you just don't even know how they are affecting how you're feeling, how you're interacting, how you're making your choices.
Yeah, and we all like to think we're a good judge of character, but are we really?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
How many great friendships have we missed out on because we leapt to a conclusion?
Well, that's exactly right, isn't it? And that's part of the whole concept too, you know? And so, I mean, it's not like I wrote the book thinking of that, but as I looked at the different pieces, that clearly was clearly seemed like it was a thread. And so I rolled with that as the...
Now, the pieces in this book are very diverse in size, in sort of, some of them are really kind of prose poems. Some of them have a real storyline. Some of them are just a snapshot in time.
Yes.
Is there, when you sit down to write, how do you know what you're going to end up with, or do you? And how do you come up with, how do you end up with so many different styles, I guess, of short story?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if I have the answer to that. I mean, I think a lot of it depends on what you're thinking about. Like, there's some sort of nugget of an idea for a story, right? And so I think that drives it to a fashion. And that it's sort of like, I mean, it's the same thing with songs. It sort of like begs a certain kind of landscape, from the basic idea. At the same time, there's some of it that's more random, I think, and then some of it comes through the editing. I think there's a couple pieces in the book that were radically edited from bigger pieces. So it's a variety of things, really. They seem to suggest their own form. I don't know. That's about the best I can take it, because certain things just seem to require the space to develop it, and certain pieces can be just more concise.
Do you have a favorite story in this collection?
Wow, that's hard.
It's like asking about your favorite kid, but you only have one, right? So that makes it easy.
Yeah. I kind of like the story. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I like the story Linguistics because that took a different viewpoint and everything. So I like that. I just finished doing kind of a spoken word piece for Silently that I might put on my website that I thought would be fun to do. And there's something of the compact pieces. I like that one a lot. And I like Concessions, although, to be honest, some of these landed in journals. That one only recently did, again, with my friend at Canopic. But I kind of like that, too, because I think it manages to kind of get at a political background without being political, if that makes sense.
Which one was that?
Concessions.
Concessions. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you read one of the shorter ones for us? Silently would be good.
I like Identity Field, too, because it was kind of a challenging, it's just like with music. Sometimes I think when you're doing it, you're drawn to the things that are maybe more challenging, or you find more, you focus on that process. But then when people listen or read it just from their perspective, you never know what connects. It's often the opposite. It's often the things that aren't that, if that makes sense. Are you ready?
I am.
All right, Silently. Last time a homeless man asked me for money, it was by the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, where Fatty Arbuckle's career ended. Buster Keaton stayed true to his friend, and I thought of Buster as I folded a Franklin and dropped it into the man's upturned pork pie hat. The bill landed softly over scattered change, covering it like a newspaper blanket. The man quietly nodded his thanks. That was a bit much, my cousin said, as we continued walking. What if he spends it on drugs? Or worse, he added, snapping his words like chewing gum. My cousin had never given me a gift that he didn't follow up on, asking if I'd played it, read it, or wore it, dependent. What if he does, I said. It was a gift. He can do whatever he likes. Maybe it's what he needs right now. I wondered what worse could be as we turned the corner and passed the storefront where Tippi Hedren met Rod Taylor at the pet store in The Birds. Something apocalyptic? Seemed like the man was already in a state of worse. That's funny coming from you, he added, eager to emphasize the fact that I was a teetotaler since he was not. My cousin was a bricklayer. I taught school children. He hunted venison. I was a vegetarian. He wore MAGA hats while I raged against the machine. For him, there was always competition. As we passed the Bay Area Mindfulness Center, the sun shimmered over the China Basin, just past where we were about to take in a Giants game, the last remaining link to our childhood. I thought of Buster Keaton again, and the baseball scene and the cameraman. No words, just action. Pure genius.
And that was Doug Hoekstra reading silently from his short story collection, 10 Seconds in Between. Flash fiction. What do you like about that? And what is it exactly?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the flash fictions too. I'll be honest. You asked about what creates form. I mean, sometimes you'll see little calls for stories that are like, where they ask you to do like 50 words or 150 words or 500 words, and I'm always drawn to that because I think it's such a great challenge. Because I think good writing says more with less. I mean, obviously there's poetic language, and there are writers like, I don't know, D.H. Lawrence or whoever that's very important to what they do. So I don't dismiss that. But I think it's a great challenge to see if you can just set it up and just give it enough. And I think if you do it right, that gives the reader more space to get in, you know? I mean, in music, and I believe in this too, it's all dynamics, and it's the space between the notes as much as the notes, right? And so I think in Flash you get kind of a similar kind of idea going.
Right. And of course the most famous one is the 6-word story. For sale, baby shoes, never worn.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, isn't that beautiful? I mean, and so I think it's a great challenge as a writer. I think if they come out right, they're really interesting for a reader. And the other thing about it is, and you went back to the varied length in the collection and everything, I did think about the fact that, you know, and I kind of thought about this with my poetry book too, that like, I mean, people, you know, a couple of years ago I read Moby Dick for the first time, and people still do that. Yes, that's true. But at the same time, people also live in a world where sometimes they're moving around and they don't have long pieces of time. And to me, with both of these last couple of books, I wanted to make it kind of interactive to the point where you could like read part of it and then come back to it, and read part of it and come back to it, and they'd almost be like different experiences if you choose. So
that's interesting, because you like your CDs for people to listen to the whole thing at once, and you like your books for people to read parts and come back to them.
Well, isn't that true? I guess that's a little contrary. But actually, people can listen to the individual tracks too, you know. Yeah. But the book still works as a whole. But you know, it's just I just like the idea of people being able, if they want, to pick out a couple flash pieces, or to dig into a more involved story.
Absolutely. Well, where can people find your book, find your CD? Where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, well, probably go to my website, and then all the links are there because they're in various spots Like I know on the book isn't quite out yet. I know we're going to have it first up at the press, better than Starbucks, but you can link to that from my website. The CDs and things like Bandcamp and Amazon and streaming and various brick and mortar depending. So, but I think the best thing, if people are interested, they go to doughoekstra.net, and there'll be a link on there that goes straight to The Day Deserved, where it has all the backstory and info on that for the CD, and a link where they can go straight to 10 Seconds in Between for all the information on the book. And those are both on the front page.
And also can find your poetry collection there, unopened. And
yes.
Yeah.
And all other kinds of goodies. Please, you get the videos, you might get some spoken word, you can spend your whole day there, right?
Well, thank you for joining us again, Doug.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And I look forward to seeing what you do next year.
All right. Enjoy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Our next guest has been on Writers' Voices twice before, and we always love talking with her. But, Mom, why don't you reintroduce our guest?
My pleasure. Thank you. Our guest today is Pam Jenoff, and she's the author of several books of historical fiction, including the bestsellers The Orphan's Tale and The Lost Girls of Paris, both of which spent multiple weeks on the New York Times and USA Today bestseller lists, among others. She holds a degree in international affairs from George Washington University and a degree in history from Cambridge, and she received her Juris Doctor from the University of Pennsylvania. Her novels are inspired by her experiences working at the Pentagon as a diplomat for the State Department in handling Holocaust issues in Poland. She lives with her husband and 3 children near Philadelphia, where she teaches law. And I cannot believe that she does all that stuff. This is a page turner. This is The Woman with the Blue Star, and it's a page turner for sure.
So, Pam, are you still teaching?
I am.
Oh,
so this
my.
year, due to the pandemic, it was virtual, but I'm in about my 12th year teaching law school at Rutgers.
Wow. And how many books now?
So this is The Woman with the Blue Star is my 11th book.
It's your 11th book. Wow. And we talked to you about The Lost Girls of Paris. That was a little over 2 years ago. And I think about The Orphan's Tale, which would have been, what year would that have been?
2017.
2017. And do you have another one coming out soon, in addition to this one?
Soon is a relative term, so I do not. I'm feverishly working on my new book, which will be out in early 2023. Now, that sounds really far away probably to you, but it sounds very soon to me.
Well, all the details that go in your books, I can understand how you have to do a lot of research and everything.
It's true. I'm what I would call a contemporaneous researcher, so I'm able to research a lot of it as I'm going along, which is useful because it's just a part of the brain in a different time of day than writing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting. So, well, let's talk a little bit about that. You've got the stories that we've dealt with. These last 2 were World War II stories. How many of your books are set in World War II?
So I would say the majority of my books are historical fiction. I did write 2 modern books. And of those, the majority are set around World War II, although I have written 1 book set after World War I, and I've also done a World War II book on the home front. But let's say, 7 or 8 of my books are set during World War II, including The Woman with the Blue Star.
Exactly. And how do you get the concept for the stories? Are they usually based on some element, some true story that you heard?
Well, so my love of the era comes from the years I spent in Poland as a diplomat for the State Department working on Holocaust issues. But the actual stories I go looking for, I go researching. And what I'm looking for as I research is what I call the gasp. It's the aha moment. Because if a story is so unknown and incredible that it still makes me gasp after 25 years of working with the Holocaust, then I'm hopeful it will do the same for you, my readers. And I don't write true stories. Whenever anyone says inspired by action, based on a true story, I cross that out and I say inspired by, because I very much write fiction. But I do look for a true idea to inspire me.
Wow. So tell us how you found the story that inspired the woman with the blue star.
So I was researching, I was looking online for an idea, and I came across an incredible true story of a group of Jewish people who survived World War II by hiding in a sewer. And I don't mean that they hid like they ran through the sewer on their way out of town. They hid as in they lived in the sewer for more than a year. And when I heard this idea, I had so many questions. I wanted to know how had they survived and what were their lives like and who had helped them. And I was particularly taken by an anecdote from the real story of a young girl in the sewer who looked up through the grate. She saw a girl her own age buying flowers, and she was so struck by the disparity between her life in the sewer and this girl on the street. Her mother said to her, "Someday there will be flowers for you." It was this kind of promise. And hearing this, I was just so taken, and I wondered what would have happened if the girl on the street and the girl above had seen one another and become friends, and what would that have meant for both of their lives.
Mm-hmm. And so you wrote this magnificent book.
Thank you. Thank you.
The gentlemen in the book, both of these girls, Ella and Sadie, have a man in their lives, and they are interesting because they're coming from, one of course is Sadie's, of course, is Jewish because he's living there in the sewer too, and then Ella's is from the past, but he's working with the resistance and wants her to join, and she just feels like she can't do it. It's that's the Second World War is so complex. The people suffered so much, and it's just amazing to me. It really is. And that your books that tell about this are an inspiration that we can't let this happen again.
Well, thank you for that. That means the world.
So this is set in what city?
So the real people who lived in the sewer were in a city called Lviv, which is very close to the border of Ukraine. My book is set in Krakow, and I moved the story for a few reasons. First, I did want to get some distance from the real story because I'm not trying to tell their lives. Their lives are not mine to tell. And secondly, Krakow is very near and dear to my heart. I lived there for more than 2 years, and also it's a city that's a little more accessible to readers. So my story is set in Krakow.
Mm. And the two girls are, like you say, the same age. What else draws them together?
Well, it's interesting. So Sadie is living in the sewer initially with her parents, although she becomes increasingly isolated. So she is really quite alone and not just looking for physical survival, but also connection. And Ella, who's the girl on the street, at first blush, her life looks pretty good. She's not Jewish. She's not being persecuted. She's relatively affluent. But when we take a close look at Ella, we see that no family left except for a really awful stepmother who was consorting with the Germans, and her former fiance, who she thought was off fighting in the war, has in fact come back to Krakow and has not told her for certain reasons. And so Ella is also quite isolated, and these two women are both seeking connection when they see one another, and that's one of the really fascinating parts about the war, is it brought people together from such different backgrounds who otherwise might never have met.
Mm. That is a good point. Now, in Poland, can you just give us a little bit about sort of the overall history of the Nazis invading Poland? Because I think for a lot of Americans, we're not really clear on how that worked.
Sure. So, Poland is adjacent to Germany, right? And it's been tossed back and forth so many times in history by various powers, Germany, Russia, Austria, Hungary, all of the surrounding countries. One writer, Norm Davies, I think actually called it God's playground at one point. It's just been through all these wars. So when World War II starts, the Germans invade pretty quickly. I think, I don't want to say this wrong, but I'm pretty sure September 1939, and they just kind of roll into Poland. And Poland is this ideal location to be occupied by the Germans because it has these train lines and these rail lines. And so the Germans occupy it. They subjugate the Poles. The Poles, although not treated to exactly the same treatment as the Jews, were treated very much as an inferior race. And so 3 million Poles died during the war as well. And the Germans placed every death camp. The concentration camps were everywhere, but the worst of the death camps were all in Poland. And so it's a country that is suffering, but also a country that has a really complicated history with its Jewish residents. At various points, things were not good for the Jews in Poland. And so I think local people really had to ask themselves, like, what am I going to do? Am I going to be kind of a hero? Am I going to be a bystander? Or am I going to be a collaborator?
Oh, wow. And you, of course, choose to tell the stories of the people who are heroes.
Well, I think I tell the stories. I like to tell all the stories, and I like to show gray areas in people. So when I grew up, history was very black and white and broad brushstrokes. And then I went to Poland, and I found things much more nuanced and complicated. So you will see, for me, it's all about the individualized response of, people during the war. So what makes the stepmother collaborate while a simple sewer worker like Pavel takes it upon himself to help the Jews in the sewer?
Mm. Well, why don't you read a little bit from The Woman with the Blue Star?
I will. So I'm going to read the prologue, and I want to say, just to set this up, this is not part of the historical story. This is set in the present day, and it kind of sets up where the story is going. So it is set in Krakow in June of 2016. The woman I see before me is not the one I expected at all. 10 minutes earlier, I stood before the mirror in my hotel room, brushing some lint from the cuff of my pale blue blouse, adjusting a pearl earring. Distaste rose inside me. I had become the poster child for a woman in her early 70s, graying hair cut short and practical, pantsuit hugging my sturdy frame more snugly than it would have a year ago. I patted the bouquet of fresh flowers on the nightstand, bright red blooms wrapped in crisp brown paper. Then I walked to the window. Hotel Wenzel, a converted 16th century mansion, sat on the southwest corner of the Rinnek, Krakow's immense town square. I chose the location deliberately, made sure my room had just the right view. The square, with its concave southern corner, giving it rather the appearance of a sieve, bustled with activity. Tourists thronged between the churches and souvenir stalls of the Sukanitsa, the massive oblong cloth hall that bisected the square. Friends gathered at the outdoor cafes for an after-work drink on a warm June evening, while commuters hurried home with their parcels, eyes cast toward the clouds darkening over Wawel Castle to the south. I had been to Krakow twice before, once right after communism fell, and then again 10 years later when I started my search in earnest. I was immediately won over by the hidden gem of a city. Though eclipsed by the tourist magnets of Prague and Berlin, Krakow's old town, with its unscarred cathedrals and stone-carved houses restored to the original, was one of the most elegant in all of Europe. The city changed so much each time I came, everything brighter and newer, better in the eyes of the locals, who had gone through many years of hardship and stalled progress. The once gray houses had been painted vibrant yellows and blues, turning the ancient streets into a movie street version of themselves. The locals were a study in contradictions, too. Fashionably dressed young people talked on their cell phones as they walked, heedless of the mountain villagers selling wool sweaters and sheep's cheese from tarps laid on the ground, and a scarf-clad babcha who sat on the pavement begging for coins. Under a store window touting Wi-Fi and internet plans, pigeons pecked at the hard cobbled of the market square as they had for centuries. Beneath all of the modernity and polish, the Baroque architecture of the old town shone defiantly through, a history that would not be denied. But it was not history that brought me here, or at least not that history. As the trumpeter in the Mariatsky church tower began to play the Haynel, signaling the top of the hour, I studied the northwest corner of the square, waiting for the woman to appear at 5 as she had every day. I did not see her, and I wondered if she might not come today, in which case my trip halfway around the world would have been in vain. The first day, I wanted to make sure she was the right person. The second, I meant to speak with her but lost my nerve. Tomorrow I would fly home to America. This was my last chance. Finally, she appeared from around the corner of a pharmacy, umbrella tucked smartly under one arm. She made her way across the square with surprising speed for a woman who was about 90. She was not stooped, her back was straight and tall. Her white hair was pulled into a loose knot atop her head, but pieces had broken free and fanned out wildly, framing her face. In contrast to my own staid clothing, she wore a brightly colored skirt, its pattern vibrant. The shiny fabric seemed to dance around her ankles by its own accord as she walked, and I could almost hear its rustling sounds. Her routine was familiar, the same as the previous 2 days, when I watched her walk to the Café Novolorsky and request a table farthest from the square, sheltered from the activity and noise by the deep arched entranceway of the building. Last time I had come to Krakow, I was still searching. Now I knew who she was and where to find her. The only thing to do was summon my courage and go down. The woman took a seat at her usual table in the corner, opened a newspaper. She had no idea that we were about to meet, or even that I was alive. From the distance came a rumble of thunder. Drops began to fall then, splattering the cobblestones like dark tears. I had to hurry. If the outdoor cafe closed and the woman left, everything I came for would be gone. I heard the voices of my children telling me it was too dangerous to travel so far alone at my age, that there was no reason, nothing more to be learned here. I should just leave and go home. It would matter to no one. Except to me, and to her. I heard her voice in my mind as I imagined it to be, reminding me what it was that I had come for. Steeling myself, I picked up the flowers and walked from the room. Outside, I started across the square. Then I stopped again. Doubts reverberated through my brain. Why had I come all of this way? What was I looking for? Doggedly, I pressed onward, not feeling the large drops that splattered my clothes and hair. I reached the cafe, wound through the tables of patrons who were paying their checks and preparing to leave as rain fell heavier. As I neared the table, the woman with the white hair lifted her gaze from the newspaper. Her eyes widened. Up close now, I can see her face. I can see everything. I stand motionless, struck frozen. The woman I see before me is not the one I expected at all. So that's it.
Yes.
And that was Pam Jenoff reading from The Woman with the Blue Star. Now, what was a blue star? We're familiar with the yellow star, but what was a blue star?
So yes, when we read history, many of us think of the yellow star that Jewish people in most of occupied Europe would have had to wear on their clothing. But I discovered through my research that in some parts of occupied Europe, including this part of Poland, many Jews wore a white armband with a blue star as the marking. And so that's the significance of the title. However, stars play a really large symbolic role in other ways throughout the book.
Yeah, right.
Can you describe one of them?
Well, Sadie is looking up through the sewer, of course, and she's seeing the stars at night. And stars were always a really important thing to her, as her childhood. And so, of course, not being able to see the full sky from the sewer is one of the things she misses most. And she talks to Ella about it, and Ella sort of had never thought about the stars. It was just something she took for granted, but it becomes a real bonding point.
How big are sewer tunnels? Is it possible to stay dry?
So it's really interesting. When I started researching the project about the actual people in Lviv, there's a wonderful nonfiction book called In the Sewers of Lviv by Robert Marshall, and he details all of the ways they lived. And one of the most fascinating parts is that in Lviv, some of these sewer tunnels are as big as like a tunnel you could drive through. I mean, there's a raging river going through them and kind of a small footpath on the side that you navigate. I actually, on my Facebook page, at one point had posted a photo of what this looks like. And then other pipes are so narrow that you literally would have to lay on your stomach and shimmy. So they were called 40s because they were 40 inches in diameter. And so I was learning about all of this. And then, of course, when I switched the story to Krakow, I had to make sure all of that was still plausible. So I had a sewer expert from the city who helped me.
How did did you find that person?
Well, I'll tell you I can't say it's a funny story, but I had planned a research trip to Krakow. It was going to be my first trip back in 17 years, and I booked it for March 11th, 2020. So, of course, the whole world shut down, and I did not get to go. But I'm very lucky. I still have friends in the U.S. consulate in Krakow, and they were helping me arrange my trip. And then when everything got canceled, they pivoted, and they helped me get in touch with the experts remotely, even as their own city was shutting down.
Wow.
Oh, my goodness. The fact that you lived in Krakow, and because there's so many details in this book about the places and the streets and everything, the buildings and everything, that's because you lived there, so you knew the how to write about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, Krakow's very much in my bones and in my blood. So, I mean, it's always nice to be able to travel, but in this case, I sort of relied on my memory, a lot of research, and then I had experts. I had the sewer expert, the city expert, the language expert. You know, I had all the people.
Because 17 years, well, you probably have pictures, but it's hard to remember after 17 years.
Right, although my memories may be more vivid because the city has changed so much. I can't imagine going now where there's like shopping malls and multiplexes and, you know, that sort of thing. It's very different now.
Oh, that's a good point. That's a good point. Do you plan to go once things open up again?
I'm not traveling until the last of my kids can be vaccinated, but I do owe myself a giant trip to Poland. And I think last time I was going to go by myself, but I think this time people will come with me.
So what is it about Krakow that draws you? What is it that you love about it?
Krakow is sort of, as I say in the reading, is this incredible city that was never destroyed during the war. It was preserved. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So all of the buildings are in the original, which is amazing. The people are really wonderful, super friendly place to visit. And as a Jewish person, you know, Jews were in Krakow for 800 years. And so I just feel what they call this sense of Yiddishkeit, this sense of Jewishness in the city that's kind of like in the sidewalk, in the cobblestones, you know, plus the actual history and the people.
Oh, that is cool. So do you feel that being Jewish is one of the reasons that you've devoted so much of your career, both writing and your career outside of writing, to Holocaust issues?
You know, I went to Poland in 1996, right as the country had come out of communism, and there were a lot of issues from World War II they had not been able to resolve when they had no free speech, you know, behind the, you know, that sort of wall of communism there. And these issues became important in the 90s. And so I went to Poland, Jewish, alone. I had no family there, and we had no cell phones or internet, so I was completely cut off. And I was drawn to the Jewish community, the survivors, and they became like grandparents to me. And I was just so moved and changed by the years I lived over there. So being Jewish is kind of what brought me to this material, but I think it was the experience of living there among the people that drew me to the writing.
Wow. So there were people in Krakow who stayed and hid and survived.
There were many Jewish people who survived, and then of course a large majority would have moved to the United States or other countries, you know, when they could, and also through the communist years. But there is a small surviving community there of people who chose to stay, you know, and also people who came there from other places, say in Russia or Ukraine, and landed in Krakow and stayed. So the Jewish community now is actually stronger than when I was there. There's a JCC, and there's, you know, more Jews than there were when I lived there. So it's had kind of a rebirth.
Oh, yeah, you kind of have to wonder sometimes how somebody could stay in a place where they found so much misery or where their families met so much misery. But on the other hand, why should they have to leave?
If their family's there, their businesses are there, you know, and all of them have a sister in Maryland and could have come here. So it's not like they were forced to stay. That's a choice and a very brave choice. And fortunately, right now they live their daily lives largely, although there's obviously big questions of anti-Semitism, their daily lives are not persecuted. They are safe and free in a democracy.
Wow. Pam, tell me a little bit about and you've probably told us this in earlier interviews, but about your writing process, you say you research while you're writing. Do you edit while you write, or do you get everything, a first draft down, and then go back?
Oh, that's complicated. So I'm what they call a pantser. So I write by the seat of my pants. So I have an idea and I just throw words down and for months, and it's the worst way to write because, the editing is just very, very rough on that. So I just keep going over and over those words until they're together, That's sort of how I do it.
Okay. And so you've got this basic idea for a story. So it doesn't sound like you've plotted it out before you start writing. You just start writing?
Yeah, I just threw down. I mean, when I wrote The Woman with the Blue Star, quite honestly, my first draft was terrible, and I had to go rewrite 95% of this book. And so I hope not to repeat that experience again. So I do outline a bit now in the form of a chapter outline, but I'm still a pantser. Like the words are still coming out in a random order.
Then how do you actually get them into the order that is so easy to read and really draws people along?
Oh, it takes forever. But I will say, thank goodness for cut and paste. I don't know if you could have been a pantser back when we were using typewriters.
Oh, I know.
Because you can move everything around.
Yeah. Well, I used to write a lot by hand, and my notebooks, you'd have things crossed out and arrows drawn and all kind. It was very challenging. But you're right. I remember writing before computers, but it sure makes it a whole lot easier now. So how many drafts do you think you end up with before you get to the final one?
I don't know, because it's like all one draft. You know what I mean? First it's just words, and then you put them in order, and then you smooth it out, and then, so for me it's like a layering. Somebody once said that the plotters, they build scaffolding, but the pantsers, it's more like an archaeological dig where you pick up something and you're like dusting it off. So it's a very organic process is the only way I could describe it.
Oh, that is cool. I like that metaphor. So how do you know when you're done?
I'm not one of these writers that turns in a perfect draft. Mine are, it's still, it reaches this point where it's almost like what I imagine cooking to be if I could cook. So, where you like, does it, you have someone else taste it to see if it needs more salt, less salt, and when I get to that point, then I will show it to my agent and editor. But that's kind of at the end. Like, I don't have sample chapters to give them. I give them the whole thing at one time.
Okay. So you don't finish one chapter, go on to the next.
No, it's
you're
all
really
it's
doing
all at
everything
once.
at once, and on a given day, how do you decide where to start? Once you've got your first draft down, how do you decide where to start that day?
It's hard. I think that different days, you kind of just have to find a way to move the ball forward every single day, right? So in the early morning, maybe I have the lights out because the puppy's sleeping. I just throw down words. And then later in the day when the 9 to 11 block when I have that's a really good time to structure things and figure out where they all go. Later in the day, if my writing brain is tired, I might be doing some researching. So, and then different parts of the book, like today, what I'm working on, the middle was giving me a fit, but I needed more work time, so I gave myself permission to work on the ends.
That sounds like a really fascinating process, and I'm glad you could keep track.
Thank you.
Well, Pam, we are out of time today. It was really lovely to have you here today. And Mom, do you have a quote for us?
Yes, well, it's not exactly a quote, but in war, nobody wins, of course. And many people suffer on both sides of the conflict. But as in this story, kindness to one another is the light at the end of the black tunnel of suffering.
Oh.
Beautiful.
Right. Well, thank you, and I look forward to your next book because they are always such a good read.
Oh, yes.
I hope to come back and see you then. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.